It is a great pleasure to welcome a folklorist who is currently helping to shape the presence and futures of the field, Anthony Buccitelli. He is, I am pleased to say, not unfamiliar to UC Berkeley. He reports that Berkeley's founding folklorist, Alan Dundes, in his own inimitable style, called him on the telephone, asking him to renounce his trajectory toward a career in philosophy, a field in which he had graduated with honors from Oberlin, in favor of entering the UC Berkeley graduate folklore program, and the rest simply is history. After presenting an ethnographic study that explored the part of his own personal experience as a member of the Boston community and his own remarkable ethnographic encounter with immersion in winter New England coastal waters, he finished his master's thesis in folklore before joining the community of scholars who have productively linked American, and in his case, New England studies, to folkloristic as he went on for a PhD program at Boston University. Receiving his degree there in 2012 rather, he soon joined the American Studies program at Penn State University, where he has for a while served as the director of the Center for Holocaust and Jewish Studies, and now is an associate professor of American Studies and Communication, as well as the director of the Pennsylvania Center for Folklore. Now, since that time, he published a fascinating book, City of Neighborhoods, Memory, Folklore, and Ethnic Place in Boston, with the University of Wisconsin Press. There he builds on, but pushes beyond so many bodies of literature in folkloristics and American studies. Even as the book is fundamentally about place, here the neighborhoods in Boston that he knew as a local, the book pushes along even the most sophisticated formulations of place and space in folkloristics, such as the fusion of folkloristics and critical geography in the work of Berkeley folklore faculty member Timothy Tangerlini, to think about how existing social categories are spatialized, but about how emerging modes of performatively creating what were previously and problematically categorized as local, national, and cosmopolitan are themselves co-produced. In City of Neighborhoods, he also takes up the continual multi-layered production of spatialization, a theme that runs through a number of his key publications. In a series of articles in folkloristics and influential edited in folkloristic journals and influential edited volumes, he has rethought the history of folkloristics and pushed ahead to rethink how folklorists can analyze digital presence and futures. Pushing beyond a sometimes common celebration of, oh, gee, I just found a wonderful trove of exciting digital folklore, he has gone on to develop fascinating frameworks to think not only analytically about digital folklore, but about basic disciplinary premises that relied upon essentialist understandings of, in Derrida's terms, the metaphysics of presence, a privileging of what was constructed as face-to-face and the oral, but at the same time without embracing a digital emperor's new clothes attitude, as if analytics need to suddenly be reinvented whole cloth. For example, his contribution, Performance 2.0, Observations Toward a Theory of Digital Performance of Folklore, in Trevor Blank's volume, Folk Culture in the Digital Age, turned this binary on its head and opened up new possibilities for rethinking both orality-centered 1970s formulations and also how one thinks about digital folklore. In addition to editing a 2-volume work, Race and Ethnicity in the Virtual World, How the Digital Age is Changing Our Impressions and Expressions, he has published articles in the Journal of American Folklore, Cultural Analysis, Western Folklore, Folklore Historian, and Proverbium, as well as been chosen to provide essays in influential folklore handbooks. And he has been, since 2017, as probably most of you know, the editor of one of our leading journals, Western Folklore. So it is really fun to be able to welcome Anthony back to Berkeley as this semester's visiting professor, associate professor of folklore and anthropology, and today's folklore roundtable lecturer which was very nicely organized by Leah Busby, our wonderful folklore archivist. His title today is Moving Traditions, Digital Technology, the Body, and the Everyday Performance of Folklore. Please put your hands together and welcome him. And then you might turn off your microphones.
Well, thank you so much, Charles, for that absolutely lovely introduction. And it's a great, pleasure to be back here, as we were just remarking, with everyone here at Berkeley. I did want to start by noting that two members of my master's thesis committee are currently with us, being, of course, Charles Briggs and Tim Tangolini. So I feel a little bit like I'm in a reboot of my examination phase of my degree thing here. So we'll try to live up to those expectations. But thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you very much to Leah as well for organizing this whole event. It's really a great pleasure. Okay, so I think I'm going to start off here first, of course, by sharing my screen with you. And just let me know if you can see that. Can everybody see? Okay, great. I didn't want to do it like one of those things you read about where you give the whole talk with a blank screen. Okay, so today I'm talking about digital technology, the body, and the everyday performance of folklore. And because I'm a folklorist, I do like stories. So I'm going to start kind of with a story, and I'm going to intersperse some stories along the way. So story number one. After many years of using an Apple iPhone, I made the switch about a year ago to a Google Pixel 3a. Getting a new phone is still a little exciting for me, having lived largely in a pre-smartphone world. And been very late, in fact, to adopt one. I will admit to feeling a little sense of wonder the first time I start up a new phone and I see those crisp colors of the company logo flash across the screen. And it was no different with the Pixel than it was with any of the previous phones that I've owned. In fact, as I played around with the phone over the course of the next few months, feeling out its different capabilities and limitations as one always does with a new device, I found that it was similar in many ways, perhaps in almost every way, to the iPhone that I had previously used. There were more apps available for it, but not that many more that I really cared about using. And the affordances of the phone seemed to remain more or less the same. And the basic app-based organizational system was also very similar, at least on the level of the user. Oh, now I need to make sure I can cue my slides. And yet, I found that for the first 6 months after I bought it, I was using it very little. Instead, I would pick up my now ancient iPhone when I was around the house, since it now no longer had cell service, and I would use that instead. Somehow, the iPhone felt more familiar, more easier. It was comforting to use, not because of any major difference of function or affordance, but because it felt more natural in my hand. It felt like an extension of myself in the same way that one's fingers do. It could be moved without much in the way of focused thought. By contrast, when I tried to use the Pixel, similar as it was, tiny differences in the user interface conditions, the position of the volume buttons, the pattern of tapping to move or delete apps, the way my fingers fit on the keyboard, all required me to devote attention to my bodily actions, attention that jarred me away from the mental experience that I was having on the screen. Only very slowly, over the course of many months, did I little by little become comfortable enough using the new phone so that this feeling dissipated. In communication or technology studies terms, what I was engaged in during this period might be called the domestication of a new technology, at least on a personal level. This term first coming into significant use in relation to the adoption of digital technologies, sometimes referred to as ICTSs or Internet Computers and Phones, in the early to mid 1990s has been described by Leslie Haddon as, quote, the process at work as people both individually and especially in households encounter ICTs and deal with them, sometimes rejecting these technologies, at other times working out exactly how to fit them into their everyday routines, unquote. In a larger sense, as Knut Sorensen has argued, quote, we tame technologies that surround us in our everyday lives. This process of taming is characterized by reciprocal change. We form relationships or networks with technologies in which meanings are attributed and actions delegated to the parts that constitute the network, unquote. And yet, in a more specific way, the process I'm describing was not just working out how to fit this device into my everyday routine or how to form networked relations of action and meaning. It was an intimate experience, an experience of the body, a set of habits formed through a long relation, not with smartphones in general, but with a specific smartphone, or at least a specific model. In that sense, I was engaged in an embodied process of learning. Through sustained haptic interactions with the device, I was cultivating both an embodied understanding of the affordances of the technology, as well as a set of bodily dispositions in relation to the materialized form of the phone. The rise of sensory studies and sensory ethnography, as well as a renewal of focus on embodiment and kinesthesia in performance studies, a rising concern for the material aspects of digital technologies, and increased attention to locative and geospatial media has helped to drive explorations of the connections between the body and digital technologies in everyday life. Building on the theoretical perspectives of Edward Hall, for example, communications scholar John MacArthur argues for attention to what he calls digital proxemics, a study of the way in which we hold our bodies and move in physical spaces in relation to digital technologies. Along a similar line, David Parisi, Mark Patterson, and Jason Edward Archer call for the creation of what they term a haptic media studies, an area of inquiry that could, quote, help reveal the role that touch plays in shaping habits of mediatric interaction by highlighting the structured techniques of the body that accrue gradually around media forms. In my 2012 book chapter, Performance 2.0, Observations Towards a Theory of the Digital Performance of Folklore, I made the case that folklorists should examine digital technologies as what I referred to as places of performance, rather than simply as texts transmitted online or as recordings of offline human activity. And certainly, a more fully formed theory of the performance of folklore in digital spaces remains to be fully articulated. Yet in subsequent works, especially my 2013 essay, Virtually a Local, Folk Geography, Discourse, and Local Identity on the Geospatial Web, and my 2017 article, Locative Gaming, Folk Geographies, and the Experience of Cultural Heritage, I've begun to push folklorists to also consider the ways in which digital technologies are integrated into our physical experiences. Attempting to forward that goal, I will in this lecture explore two other critical but little examined avenues for the study of folklore and the digital. The role that technology in everyday face-to-face, the role of technology in everyday face-to-face performances, and the creative construction of online folklore forms that are intended to evoke haptic responses in offline settings. With regard to the former, I will discuss two aspects of technology and performance: the role of digital technologies as externalizations of tradition memory, that form of social memory that preserves and transmits knowledge of how to appropriately perform folklore, and the way in which mobile devices as expressive tools are being integrated into our bodily repertoires in performance, especially through creative and situated acts of sharing. I will then briefly call attention to the emergence of contemporary meme or image macro forms, a much studied set of folkloric forms indeed, that are designed to leverage the affordances of mobile devices and to provoke bodily responses from their users as part of their overall aesthetic strategy. I've discussed some of these examples in other settings in the past, but here I wanted to bring them together in the service of a larger call for a new orientation in the study of folklore and digital technology. Beginning with the consideration of the role of digital technologies in tradition memory, let me get to my second story. On a sunny afternoon in the East Bay in late January, just after the Lunar New Year, I'm lounging around in a small living room in Deborah's apartment, watching her 4-year-old niece and her slightly older son play together. After a little while, Deborah suddenly says, "Hey, we never did the New Year's bows this year." The child of a Korean immigrant father and an Italian-American mother, Deborah's family does not generally observe many of what they see as Korean traditions, besides those having to do with foodways. But they do make certain exceptions for a few traditions that she and her younger siblings remember practicing as children with their father and aunt, who both immigrated from Korea to the United States as young adults. The traditions they continue to observe include the life cycle ritual of Toljabi, or the celebration of the child's first birthday, as well as the calendar tradition of having children do obeisance to their parents on the Lunar New Year in exchange for a small amount of spending money. But even these maintained traditions have been done only sporadically. And so after a few minutes of trying to pry the children away from their games, Deborah and her sister begin trying to describe the ritual to them. First, explaining its purpose to the children as a way to show respect for their parents and elders each year, the two sisters, knowing their audience, also stress the eventual reward of money after the ceremony is complete. Just then, however, it suddenly becomes clear that neither of the women can recall exactly how these bows should be performed. After a short debate with her sister, Deborah opens up her laptop and types a few words. She tries and rejects a few videos and then spins the machine around to face the children. "Look," she says, "here's how it's done."
안녕하세요. 오늘은 한국에서 첫날에 하는 인사, 세매의 방법을 보여드리겠습니다. 한국에서는 남자는 세매를 할 때 왼손이 오른손 위에 가게 하고 인사를 합니다.
This video was created for the website Korean Class 101, which offers free multimedia lessons in Korean language and culture through YouTube and podcasts in order to promote the paid services that it provides on its website. As she showed the video to the children, she and her sister broke down each step, explaining to each child exactly how to perform the component of the bow, and noting with surprise the differentiation that the video makes between boys and girls' bows. In fact, both women recalled that they had done what was being portrayed as the boys' bow as children. And so that's the one that they ended up instructing. After watching and listening, each child bowed properly and received the all-important monetary prize. I use this anecdote because there was so much here in play in the social and cultural interactions that took place that afternoon that should be familiar to folklorists. In a situation of impending performance, a community of more experienced participants worked together to try to establish a consensus about the proper method of performance so that a younger generation could be instructed in the traditional practices that, importantly, if lackadaisically, mark membership in their community. Accordingly, it was through a process of what Barry Tolkien has termed cultural selection that the group tested out its own tradition memory before ultimately settling on a standard for what constituted both an authentic and well-rendered performance. In fact, the only unfamiliar element in this situation, perhaps, was the incursion of the digital device as contributor to the selection process, an incursion which allowed the group to consider performances of tradition rendered in a digital space as models for the intended face-to-face performance. The introduction of digital performances as tradition models unquestionably structured the final outcome of the face-to-face performance, as well as the way that the performance was received by the audience. And I'm going to move on here. Oh, wait a minute, hold on. Excellent. It is in instances like these that the observations of technology scholar Jeffrey Boker begin to come into clearer focus. One read on the current set of memory practices, Boker writes, is that we are moving culturally from the era of recorded memory to one of potential memory. Further, he continues in a slightly different context. In the epoch of potential memory, he writes, the question is not what one knows, but rather what one can know should the need ever arise, unquote. In many ways, Boker's comments certainly seem to fit the situation I've described. Here, in a rather small and unexceptional setting of traditional performance, we suddenly find the presence of a form of external memory deeply and seamlessly integrated into the fabric of tradition memory and transmission. Although in recent years, folklorists have begun to meaningfully explore the double-sided dynamic in which forms of external memory, such as literary or popular cultural productions, often interplay with personal tradition memory in shaping performance over longer periods, what Boker's comments call attention to is a more dramatic reorganization of in situ memory practices away from recall and towards access. Thus, we might usefully reinterpret the situation I've described, not just as a failure of memory punctuated by later recourse to a text, but instead a situation in which we see both the immediate access to and integration into the event of external tradition memory. If this is true, then perhaps we might see that as Boker also argues, quote, all that has been fleeting or consigned to a folder self-consigned to dust, should we wish it, is now active and present in our lives, unquote. Deborah's presentation of the video to a group of individuals, some of whom were already what Carl Wilhelm von Sydow might have called passive bearers of tradition, put it into use not as a text authenticated by a seal of scholarly or literary authority, from which unfamiliar participants read a set of performative practices, but rather as a contribution to the group's process of cultural selection that was evaluated and authenticated by the group members' experiences of past performances. However, these videos, we should note, still carry a certain kind of authoritative weight. Yet it's a distributed form of authority rather than a hierarchical one. In this case, I would argue that the turning of the group's frame of reference outward from the personal memory of group members towards these externalized videos carried with it a move from thinking in terms of the limitations of memory in a small group to the larger memory resources of a bigger one. Thus, by finding a series of videos that all depicted similar performances and then selecting the one that best fit with the memories of the group members were both engaging in a normal process of cultural selection and also referencing an external, if granular, authority. This authority is located in the proliferation of certain forms over others, as well as in forms of quantifiable engagement, such as ratings, views, upvotes, or likes. Further, we should also note the covert role that is played by algorithms in selecting certain forms over others in response to this engagement data, as well as in response to the user's own historic pattern of use. Utilizing a performative strategy that Linda Day importantly called attention to in her classic study of the use of tape recording among Pentecostal Christians, the knowledgeable participants didn't didn't just show the video in place of oral explanation, but rather overlaid the video's presentation with their own commentary about the proper method of performance based on their personal memories. In this way, we find the videos playing a kind of hybridized role in the performative situation, serving as an external memory of previous performance, a basis for the discussion of personal memories of performance in a face-to-face context, and ultimately to develop a model for present performance. In contrast to the case Day noted, however, these videos were neither recordings of previous performances by the people involved in this situation, nor were they recordings that had been viewed or utilized by the participants in many situations prior to this one. Thus, with Boker, we might not look at these videos as themselves as the important performative tools, but rather the potentiality of these videos. The fact that one can quickly search and access recordings of this kind as the situational need arises for them suggests that we should view the searching and presentation process as the relevant practice for analysis rather than simply the content. Okay, story number 3 now. It's an unseasonably warm, sunny Sunday afternoon in October when I discover 2 things. First, that my car's inspection stickers are both expiring that day. And second, that apparently Sunday isn't a big time for auto shops to be open and ready for inspections. Calling around, I finally locate a mechanic who is somehow miraculously at work at this time, and I make an appointment to bring my car in about 30 minutes later. When I arrive at the auto garage, I find several people there. Along with the mechanic, there's a small boy who's about 5 or 6 years old, who turns out to be his nephew. And as the mechanic hooks my dying car up to some sort of car ventilator, the boy runs around the shop playing while his father, the mechanic's brother-in-law, sits in the corner periodically talking and periodically playing around with his smartphone. I make small talk with the 3 of them while my car is put through some further batteries of diagnostic tests. About 20 minutes into my visit, however, the mechanic's brother-in-law gets up and moves around the car towards the mechanic, smiling at something that he sees on his phone. He shows the mechanic, who then laughs, saying, "I've seen that one before." And then he shows the boy, who laughs as well, although it doesn't really appear to understand the humor. So his father briefly explains it to the boy, and the 3 of them chat and laugh for a moment further. Finally, noticing me, he turns the phone to me so that I can see it, and he explains that someone has just sent him this image, and he watches me view the image and laughs again. So what's happened in this scenario that's significant to the study of folklore? To answer that, I think we first need to start with the image itself. And here I want to pause and say, normally I would, of course, present the image to you, but the image that was presented to me at this time was actually a very racist image. And I'll get into that in a minute. So in keeping with Whitney Phillips and Ryan Milner's comments about the need to be sensitive towards the politics of amplification, I'm not going to present the images themselves, but I will describe in general terms what the image depicted. It had more or less an image showing Abraham Lincoln putting Kanye West into a headlock. And then it had some sort of text that expressed the idea that Lincoln was regretful of his Emancipation Proclamation. So I think you can probably get the general gist from there, and that's probably all that needs to be said about that. So I'm going to talk about the image in terms of the research I did after the fact about it. Although I had never seen this specific image before, a quick search on the internet revealed it to be a modestly circulating image macro found mainly on off-color humor sites such as 4chan, the infamous 4chan, Reddit, or I did find one on a website called dudelol.com, which I had never visited before. Obviously, the image described has racist connotations, and that fact was not lost on commentators on these sites. Although there were also a few circulating variants that took up that used different images to take up the folk idea that Lincoln felt or apparently feels regretful about his role in ending slavery. Conversely, other variants used similar images to convey very different messages or to construct a totally different joke. And of course, I'm using the term joke advisedly there. Although the person displaying the image revealed only that he had obtained it from a friend, we can see from the date stamps that the image had been circulating on the internet for at least 3 years prior to the time that I encountered it. Given then the visual nature of this text, it's relatively easy to see this kind of digital image on the internet as in some respects analogous to material folk cultures in offline settings. The type of folklore which relies on material instantiation rather than orality for its performance. Despite the closer analog we see between this image and offline material folklore in this case, I have argued elsewhere that the unique aesthetic configurations of many digital environments often render even folklore that appears oral or ephemerally performative in ways that have much in common with folklorists' understanding of the more durable performance of offline material folk culture. When I made that observation, however, I was focusing on instances in which the products resulting from folk processes were viewed in their original contexts, such as a series of interactive YouTube videos in which users engaged in a vlogged game of rock, paper, scissors. In the situation I've described here, however, the original context in which the image was created was not the venue in which it was now being displayed. Indeed, encounters with this kind of traditional text in digital environments are almost never, I would venture to say, at the moment of creation or even initial posting. Rather, most encounters, like the encounter I had here, happen through acts of what folklorists have previously referred to under the blanket term transmission, but which I think is better described as performative sharing. In their book, Spreadable Media, Creating Value and Meaning in Network Culture, media scholars Henry Jenkins, Sam Ford, and Joshua Green call for a broadening of the current discussion of participatory culture from its previous focus on acts of production and reception to, quote, roles that the network communities play in shaping how media circulates, unquote. Similarly to vernacular textual interpretive practices or the creation of fan fictions, sharing or spreading media in their terms represents a creative response to mass-mediated texts that can invest these texts with new personal or social meanings. Correspondingly, as they point out, quote, as people listen, read, or view shared content, they think not only, often not even primarily, about what the producers might have meant, but about what the person who shared it was trying to communicate, unquote. This call to reposition the media studies view on the expressive potentials of acts of sharing media has significant implications for the study of folklore in digital spaces. Folklorists have typically paid attention to the situational dynamics of the production and reception of folklore and its potentials for contingent meaning making, using the techniques and insights of various performance theories. Thus, it is particularly essential to understand whether it's possible for our existing theoretical frameworks to adequately account for sharing as an expressive practice, and as such, I argue that further attention must be paid to the poetic aspects of sharing mediated traditional texts. But to come back to the situation described here, we should also note that it featured a remarkably performative dynamic. The central actor, the mechanic's brother, through his physical movements around the room, offered each person present a chance to view the image. Each time he did so, he framed this viewing both with keying phrases and with laughter, modeling the reaction that he was clearly looking for from his audience. His comments to me, explaining how he had received the image, to the boy he offered a brief analysis to expose its humor. The reaction of his audience ranged from a bewildered giggle to a full-fledged laugh, and the acknowledgement of the traditionality of the piece with the phrase, "I've seen that one before," used by the mechanic. Also, we should note that although his real target audience was the boy and the mechanic, he acknowledged the social dynamic that would have marked me as left out of something if I had not been included in the viewing as well. And I will say I was not necessarily happy to be included in that, but I was nonetheless. Inasmuch then, as we see this as an instance of expressive interaction guided by socially determined roles for presentation and observation, it constitutes a kind of performance. In all respects, other than the use of shared digital content, this moment of breakthrough into performance, as ethnographer Del Himes termed it, was indistinguishable from conventionally understood face-to-face performances. Though minimal, the performer made use of verbal, auditory, and gestural resources to properly situate the image in a way that it could be best appreciated. The audience reacted to the image through their facial expressions, laughter, and oral interactions with the central performer. In other words, it involved the assumption of the same kind of performative roles and responsibilities that would normally characterize the oral performance of a joke. Discussions of performance in folkloristics have often centered on an initial creative act. Common points of focus included the moment of oral narration, or as with visual or material folklore, later displays of the product by the creator as the performative event. Yet the situation described above does not involve an act of creation or recreation, such as the reproduction of a previously heard joke, as the centerpiece of performance, but rather the act of sharing materials created entirely by others. Also, importantly, this act of sharing was not executed in a strictly digital realm, but rather involved an embodied performance that was constituted in physical space, but using a digital device and digital content. But with the exception of a few works, these kinds of hybrid online-offline expressive practices have been all but overlooked in the study of digital folklore. And yet, given the increasing centrality of mobile devices in everyday life, expressions which integrate these devices may represent some of the most pervasive, diverse, and meaningful of contemporary vernacular performative practices. To close, I want to now borrow a scholarly play out of one of my mentors who is not here with me today. And as I mentioned earlier, two of them are Charles and Tim. But this is Alan Dundes. Dundes often drove home his theoretical points by observing that the folk, quote unquote, themselves acknowledge these ideas within their traditional expressions or practices. Thus, I wanted to quickly call attention to another somewhat unexpected way that folklore bridges the gap between the online and offline. In my first example, we saw digital technologies as providing wide access to an array of tradition memory from which offline performers can select elements for performance. In my second example, I highlighted the way in which the sharing of a traditional text circulating online in a racist joke formed the basis for offline bodily performances, which closely resembled our model for offline performances of folklore. For this last section, I want to call attention to an even more intimate role that traditional materials circulating in digital spaces have routinely begun to play in connection with our offline bodies. And I'll present two examples, both of which take advantage of similar poetic devices. And I just talked about this in one of my classes, so my students will be familiar with these two examples here. So to begin with, the skulls macro. And I prefer macro to meme, but that's just an idiosyncrasy of mine, I suppose. This particular example builds on a traditional image macro format, a traditionalized visual textual form, which typically presents images of 7 identical human skulls labeled with various social identity distinctions, such as black, white, gay, straight, male, female, rich, poor, and so forth. The visual and textual arrangement seems to invoke 19th century evolutionary images, which propose to show stages of evolutionary development of a species, or perhaps phrenological images, which propose to identify differences in moral character and mental abilities, often along the lines of race or gender, by locating differences in the size and shapes of human skulls. Yet the 7 identical skull images in the macros here present exactly the opposite message. There is no difference between the skulls of different people. The joke in these images then typically relies on the final 8th image, which shows an ape skull with a humorous comment such as people who bring infants to the movies, or people who don't like memes, or in the third case here, people who say GIF instead of GIF. And I take no position in that particular fight. But I was intrigued when I came across a variant form of this particular macro that I present here. In this variant, however, the image seemingly defies the normal pattern of 7 identical human skulls with 1 ape skull. Instead, it asks the users to zoom in on the image to see tiny and lightly printed text and images that have been hidden within the main image. It asks users to zoom first into the straight skull's forehead, and then to the bottom left-hand corner, and then to the black skull's nose, where eventually the user finds a tiny image seen in the lower left of an ape skull that is labeled "you." This image is poetically constructed to rely on human interaction for its humor. One can't simply read the joke. One has to take action in order to create the humorous effect. Essentially, it plays on a traditionalized form, but overlays this form with required bodily movements in a pattern laid out by its creator. It's also worth noting that jokes such as this both rely on and manipulate everyday bodily practices of reading, such as moving our eyes from left to right across a text or image. To move to a second example, a second similar form of image asks, which is shown here on the left-hand side of the slide, asks the user not just to change the pattern by which the visual textual form is read, but to engage in bodily movements to create a new kind of visual effect. The image presented here in several different forms is one that circulates periodically on various meme boards, such as Reddit's R memes, or various Instagram meme pages. Although it can be viewed on any internet-enabled device, it relies on the basic assumption that most users will be viewing it on their phones. As such, it takes advantage of a specific technological affordance of many smartphones, that the use of repeated taps to zoom into or out of the image. In doing so, these images create a specific visual effect, the visual motion of jumping up and down on a trampoline as you're tapping your finger. Only when the user interacts physically with the image on the appropriate device. The 2 moments of performance that united online and offline space I discussed earlier involved digital text or videos of previous bodily performances, which formed the basis for new offline performances. And here, these texts could in principle do the same thing. However, it's worth noting on a slightly deeper level that even in digital spaces, these images rely on physical movements of the user's body to operate. In that sense, their construction involves a manipulation of the nexus between the affordances of digital technologies that allowed for them to be created, the affordances of the devices by which they are accessed, and the affordances of the human body itself. And so by calling attention in this lecture to the integration of digital technologies into our everyday practices of tradition memory, the role of mobile devices in embodied moments of performance as expressive sharing, and the ways in which people have begun to create folklore that specifically leverages the haptic or bodily affordances of digital technologies, I hope to encourage, especially the future folklorists here, to consider taking up the cause of developing a richer, more nuanced, and more dynamic approach to the study of folklore and technology. Thank you very much.
So please join your hands together and thank Anthony for an amazing, truly wonderful talk, where I think you really are laying out a whole course of study for the future. That was really quite remarkable in such a short period of time, easily graspable even by people on a Friday afternoon Zoom fatigue state. So I think that he will be willing to take some questions. We have to do the interesting sort of Zoom business of interaction. We're actually going to we're going to have to do some of the very things that he was talking about. So if you don't mind, you might either, as I'll try to see if I can see as many of you as possible, if you can do the little blue sort of hand raising thing there, that works. Some folks who find that less friendly, please just, raise your own physical hand. And then Anthony will analyze both your gesture as well as answer your question. So please.
Thank you, Charles. Yes, I'm happy to answer questions or take comments, and I would love to hear feedback as well. Or examples. I'm always looking for new data.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciated learning everything that you listed. And right now, I'm doing a research project pretty much on how multi-generational families are being impacted by COVID-19 and everything. And I'm right now, I'm still trying to find concepts that that I can use for my current research and everything. And one of the things that I learned this week was the philosophy of caring. And then now today I learned of the expressivity of sharing. So I don't know, I'd really love to hear more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the easiest way to illustrate the expressive side of sharing is actually to think about, the ambiguities of that process, right? So I actually was talking about this with my class not too long ago, and I was pointing out that when you look at Twitter profiles, one thing that sometimes people add to their Twitter profile is they'll say retweets do not equal endorsement, right? And that's an acknowledgement, right? That's an acknowledgement that sharing, that the act of sharing, or circulating media is not a neutral act, right? It's an act that is perceived to imbue something with meaning, right? And so I always like to harp on that because there is an assumption that we can kind of readily point to that when somebody shares something, it means that they are agreeing or that they believe in this thing, right? As opposed to just saying, hey, take a look at this, right? It could be that they're saying, hey, how awful is this, right? And so there is an ambiguity of meaning that's created, but that ambiguity arises from the fact that we attribute meaning to the fact that that people do circulate things in certain ways. And of course, we try to control that meaning by framing things as we share them as well. And sometimes we do that through text. Sometimes we do that through the ways in which we share things or the venues in which we share things, right? So the kinds of things that you might share on your Finsta, your sort of private Instagram account. Might not be the same sorts of things that you would share publicly because they'll be perceived differently, right? And we're sort of we acknowledge that that's the case, right? So is that speaking to what you were asking, or I'm happy to add a little bit more?
No, that definitely is, and it's giving honestly, it's giving me more words to use that for ideas that I haven't been able to describe myself.
Great, I'm glad to hear it. Oh, Tim has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony, for this really wonderful talk and this exploration of some of the performance contexts and the way these online performances are then integrated into real world performances. I'm fascinated by this spillover of online behavior into real world action. I was curious about how you, or have you even thought about the differences or the possible requirements for a different methodology between something that is largely intended to be consumed once, something like a TikTok or a Snapchat, and that type of online performance, as opposed to these potentially authoritative performances of something that you actually, it's kind of funny to see those kids performing bows, particularly the way they're dressed, in the context of New Year's. A tiny little piece of the New Year's performance that has been then reified and then sort of solidified. So I'm just curious about this challenge between, in some ways, the static representation of some aspect of traditional performance, which might be actually aligned with von Sydow's tradition bearer, as opposed to the more variant live performance, which might actually be more in line with this idea of active and passive tradition participants. So anyways, this idea of stasis versus variation in that interface between the real world and the digital. I was wondering if you had any thoughts or comments about that.
That's an interesting question. Yeah. Well, and I think what I was trying to get into a little bit, but not too heavily in the talk as well, was the fact that if you do search online for pretty much anything on YouTube, you don't find just one static rendition of it. You actually do find multiple existence and variation that is characteristic of folklore. And one of the things that I think is important to consider in that process of selection that people go through in choosing a video to model is that tension between first of all, their own memories and what they're seeing on the screen, right? So there was, in this situation I was describing, there was sort of a vague memory of something that they recalled doing in the past, that they were looking for something to sort of match that, right? And that's why they ended up selecting the boys' bow, which was what they had remembered, right? But there's also a sense of authority, I think, that's built in video form because, I think when we search, obviously, one thing we pay attention to is what video is the most viewed. What if we look at like 10 videos and they're all doing the same thing, that iteration gains in authority, right? It builds a sense that this must be the true form, right? And those variations that emerge less frequently, perhaps diminish in their sense of authority, right? So the question of so that's one aspect I was trying to dig into a little bit in the talk. The question of the difference between Snapchat, a more ephemeral mode, and YouTube, that's a more durable mode. I'm not exactly sure. Obviously, I don't think something like a Snapchat video could play into memory practices simply because it's not durable and accessible later on. So there would be no way of sort of integrating that after the fact. It could play a role in the moment, right? In mediating a performance between two people that could then, form a part of the tradition memory process like we would understand it. I think perhaps more in those conventional terms. So I think it would probably more closely resemble our kind of standard model for tradition memory. Whereas the durable and accessible and distributed model represented by something like YouTube, I think would look a little different. Is that speaking to what you were asking about?
Yeah, that's very nice. Thanks.
Great.
Rosemary.
Well, Charles, you taught me how to raise my hand. I never knew before. Oh,
You did it.
I did it. I did it. I raised my hand. Anthony, thank you very much. That was a very provocative talk, very, very interesting. And I'm wondering, I just can't help it. I'm wondering, have you thought about applying this to the political sphere? Because God, does it fit hand in glove to the sharing of memes and oh my goodness. That got me through the last 4 years with my friends. Maybe I should say the last year of the Trump presidency with my friends from Georgia, now that I live in pandemic world here in California. And it just seems to speak to what you're talking about performance in the digital sphere. Have you thought about that, or have others worked on this?
Oh, well, yes, I think so. So, you know, let me start by saying for some reason or another, there, in some of the examples I've worked with in my work, just by sort of happenstance, there's sort of political messages in some of these performances that I'm describing, obviously. But my focus and interest, I suppose, is really more on the aesthetic practices that we're seeing here, and I suppose less on the political meaning or the creation of political meaning. However, I think that Whitney Phillips and Ryan Milner have done some tremendous work in that area, specifically around the issue of ambivalence in the meaning of shared content, right? And looking at the way in which shared content can, it's essentially, it's actually kind of familiar terrain for folklorists, that something taken out of context loses its meaning and becomes sort of an open signifier that you can then attribute any sorts of meaning to.
Right.
And in the context of political discussion, you can then repurpose these this content in all sorts of different ways, and it can simultaneously, as I said, contribute to what they call amplification of certain kinds of messages, and that's something that they're particularly interested in calling the attention of journalists and scholars to try to sort of break that cycle of amplification. But I would be interested if you have a notion about how to bring that more into line with my own work. I would love to hear.
I don't really. It's in this. I am totally the folk. I had not stepped aside from it to think of it from a theoretical perspective until you started talking, and so I'm quite naive about it.
Well, I appreciate the comment, and let me think more about that, because as I say, I've been kind of doggedly focused on just that sort of performative or aesthetic dimensions of these things. And
well, doggedly focused is good. I do believe in that.
Okay.
Next in the queue, I see Jesse Mindell.
Great. First off, thank you so much. This was fascinating. Really glad to have been able to be here. I wanted to ask about your thoughts on, I suppose, what the next iteration of embodied interaction with technology and embodied performance might look like. I study human-computer interaction, and I'm really interested in tangible user interfaces in particular. And I think what you said about scrolling and other kind of common and well-worn affordances at this point becoming more performative, becoming more embodied, despite the fact that they are flat, but they're two-dimensional fundamentally, was fascinating. So I'd love to hear what you think about what the future of that might look like, or what you...
Oh, I'm sorry, you cut out there just a minute ago.
Oh, no. My apologies.
You need to unmute. There you go. If you could just repeat the last part of your question.
Yeah, sure. Sorry about that. What I was asking was, as somebody who's really interested in human computer interaction and tangible user interfaces, especially given that there's so many affordances now, as you were describing, that are highly two-dimensional, but are becoming more embodied. I was wondering what you thought the future of that embodiment might be, what kinds of interactions, whether more three-dimensional, whether more flat, you might anticipate, or what direction you hope the field might investigate in.
Well, that's a great question. And I think I'm going to give what's probably going to be kind of a disappointing answer, which is that, you know, honestly, because I'm coming at this as a folklorist, until I see the way that people are dealing with these technologies, it's a little hard for me to say how that's going to take shape, right? So, you know, obviously part of it will depend on the commonness, you know, the new technologies that emerge and the affordances that they have, and the commonness with which those are adopted into everyday usage, right? So, you know, so for example, I mean, the low-hanging fruit would be wearable technology and virtual reality forms, which have, you know, been a long time coming, but are certainly getting more and more common. And so, you know, it's tempting to say that those will be the next horizon, but who knows? We kind of have to wait and see how those technologies are adopted and integrated into the everyday experience of users before we can really make any clear assessment of that. I would say, for my part, first of all, I had a student a few years ago who was interested in VR chat, which I'm very interested to explore myself. So I'd love to look more into that aspect of how of what people are doing in that space, which I find fascinating. But I'm also particularly interested in how people are integrating wearables into their everyday experiences and routines as well. And that's something that I have not yet had a chance to explore, but I would love to do in the future. So even though I don't think those are the only two ways we can look at, and they may not even be the two most important ways, but those are ways that certainly those are things that I'm certainly interested in, I would say.
Lori Wilkie.
Always takes longer to unmute than I expect. That was a fantastic talk. Really enjoyed it. For a Friday afternoon, it was more than anyone could dare hope for. So thank you for that. I was really taken by the example in the garage, because one of the things that struck me as you told that story is that the technology allows for a certain kind of temporality to the performance, in that having, you know, the little small screen, you know, he was able to select the ordering of his audience. So first he goes to the brother who he knows is going to respond in the way that he wants. He then goes to the child who's going to want to be accepted in his response by his father and his uncle. And at that point, and by introducing it as, I got this from a friend, he's referencing a community, right, that they should want to be a part of. And then the theatrical pause and recognizing you're there. What he's done is he's grooming, right? He's created this anticipation. What is it? You know, am I going to think it's funny too? And so he's used the format of the technology to create a very different performance that puts the pressure on you then to laugh, right? So it's a really interesting innovation that is enabled by this little piece of technology, that if it were a bigger thing, you know, you would be able to see it, or if it were a joke that he told auditorily, you would have heard it. So it creates this very different kind of performative space that puts a different kind of pressure. And it was just so fascinating to me hearing that story and thinking about, oh, this puts that third person in a really uncomfortable position. What do you say? And your car there being worked on, and you're in this vulnerable kind of position to have to respond in a way that has been, it's been set up. You're supposed to respond in a particular way. So really, really fascinating. And I think the technology enables that kind of interaction in a different way than traditional modes of performance.
Interesting.
That's a great comment. Thank you so much for pointing that out. And as you were talking, I was thinking about how much what you were laying out matched that what I experienced in that moment. Because one of the things I remember in that moment was being acutely aware of the fact that I was alone in this place with these two guys, and thinking, oh God. So yeah, no, that what you're describing, the techniques in play there, absolutely fantastically capture that dimension of what was happening in that moment. So thank you for that. That's wonderful.
Well, that's great. Maybe I'll recognize myself here. One thing that's fascinating is to think about often the power of sort of cross-training between disciplines. Sometimes there's a problem that folklorists don't always sort of dig deeply into media studies. I will repeat a couple of lines from my introduction. Associate Professor of American Studies and Communication, as well as Director of the Pennsylvania Center for Folklore. So how is it that you move between American Studies, particularly Communication Studies, Media Studies, and the whole enterprise of new media studies now, and folkloristics? How do you navigate those with their tremendously different constituencies, their different theories? How do you sort of keep up with them, and how do you manage to bring them together in ways that don't just create bad bedfellows, but actually enable you to engage sort of with the presuppositions, the differing presuppositions and sort of practices associated with each discipline? I ask that partly because I'm wondering if, graduate students and undergraduates who hear, as they think about what they might want to do in their own training, how to be able to juggle those different fields, knowing that that's a precarious thing to do because you can always fall through the cracks.
Thank you. That's an interesting question. I mean, first of all, I could say, perhaps lack of focus accounts for that. But no, I think what I've tried to do is define a space for myself that makes sense to me in terms of what I want to do as a scholar, and that can take in territory from all of those different areas. So, I'm firmly an Americanist in my orientation, in the sense of my, field work and focus is generally in American life and culture. Much of my work, although what I'm doing here isn't necessarily historical, but much of my work does try to take in a historical dimension as well. But I would say that particularly the folkloristic and communication side of it is united by my interest in how culture is constructed through moments of interpersonal communication, right? How we talk to each other, how we perform for each other, how we express things to one another, and how that process unfolds in everyday life. So for me, it's kind of a natural fit, and I suppose to illustrate that, the reason that my title does bear the term communication, actually, I was sort of allowed to kind of choose how I defined my role at Penn State when I first came in, which was a great luxury. And I chose communication both because I work on media, but actually more importantly, because I see folklore as really tied to the study of communication. I think folklore and communication studies have a lot to say to one another because of our folklorist's ability to speak to these issues, right? So yeah, I guess that's all I can say is that for me, that was my space, and it sort of all makes sense when I try to step back and look at it from a bigger picture, even though it may not make sense to other people, but at least does make sense to me. So fascinating.
Well, I might say that also the fact that you were trained as an ethnographer is absolutely crucial in how it is that you're able to, I mean, you would not have made that observation about the garage, right? If you had not really been trained as an ethnographer and the way in which people are embodying and looking at the materiality of the technology in relationship to performance. And Kyoko Nagahashi also has a question.
Hi,
Great.
thank you for a wonderful presentation. Um, I'm glad Professor Wilkie brought up like temporalities. That has a little bit to do with my question, but it's not a fully formed thought. So forgive me if I'm a little scattered here. I was wondering how you would approach like digital and embodied interactions in which the temporality is not as immediate as say like a rock paper scissors game or like the narrative with the Korean bowing or the meme in the shop. And I'm thinking in particular to my research where I have medical device users looking for like advice on how to use the device online, and that's not so much an immediate interaction. And then I really like your comment about like authority and how the digital performance affords some sort of authority here, because when these medical device users are asking for advice, they are assuming that there is some sort of authority in like the either anecdotal performance that, or evidence that is given or otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So with regard to the immediacy question, you know, I think that the first thing to say is that most forms of interaction online are not in fact immediate. Some are. I mean, we're sort of engaged in an immediate form at the moment, video conferencing. But even ones that often appear to be immediate are not as immediate as one thinks, right? You know, for example, if you are using text chat or SMS, right, which certainly is a very fast form, right? You can go back and forth very quickly, but it actually has a slightly different set of affordances than immediate conversation would, right? Because of the way that text is metered out on the screen. So that question of immediacy is actually quite variegated, I think, in dealing with digital technologies. So depending on the platform you're using, that situation is going to look very different. So I think it is a lot of times, you know, in dealing with what performance looks like in those spaces, you have to kind of start with what space are you in and what are the affordances of that particular space, and how is immediacy, you know, how is sort of time dealt with in that situation. That being said, you know, one of the things that I've developed in my earlier work is to suggest that, and I made a little reference to it here, that online forms might best be considered, or the sort of closest fit with existing folklore theory was to look at them through the lens of material forms. Because when we talk about material culture, when we've sort of tried to place material culture into the frame of performance studies in the past, we've tried to put them, we've dealt with them as a sort of process of creation, but then also display, right? As all part of a sort of performative event, or part of the performance process of material culture. And I think that model actually works a little bit better because of the durability of online forms. So that process of performance can unfold sometimes over many days, weeks, months, even years, right? That an interaction can kind of take shape. But then that opens up a new set of questions, which is, where do we delimit the event, right? Where does that event begin and end? And how do we account for the many, sort of changes in context that may occur while that long event was in process, right? And so one thing I point out to my students sometimes is, one way you can get a sense for this is if you look at a very long comment thread on basically anywhere, one of the things you'll notice is that there's a kind of recursiveness to it, right? One comment will start and people will go back and forth reacting to a comment, and they'll be having this sort of conversation, and then it will sort of move on. And then if you go further and further down the thread, that same comment, that same idea reemerges. And suddenly you're having a new conversation about the same thing, but it's a different group of people, right? So again, this idea of how to parse out the idea of event in relation to digital technologies, I think, is one that can be quite complex, right? And again, is a little situational, perhaps, depending on what you're talking about. So hopefully that addressed what you were asking about, Kyoko. But great.
Yes,
great.
it did. Thank you.
That was a wonderful answer. And of course, you know, somebody who's worried a little bit about Bakhtin and the way in which words are never self-contained, and which there's always heteroglossia, there's always prior sort of discursive embodied events, and also looking towards future events. This is really interesting because it gets more complicated here. And of course, I also love to think about bilingualism or multilingualism. So it's fascinating to look at people who are moving between languages as they're also sharing devices and what is emerging on those sorts of devices. So I'm thinking here about, I wish I was back in a rainforest area of Venezuela where we're often moving between English, Spanish, and an indigenous language. And I bet you people are doing that. Well, unfortunately, not as much there because there's no internet, but that would be a fascinating sort of context to be able to look at that. If there are any more brief questions, that would be great, because I think that we've probably, with the dimensions of Zoom fatigue, probably taxed, you know, the cognitive and embodied attentions of everyone, but you've done it so successfully that I think you've held your audience in rapt attention for this time. But I think that what we would need to do, there's only one thing that makes me feel sad about your talk, which is that we're not in the Gifford room right now, so that my next words are not to invite all of you into the reception area outside for a drink and something to eat. So all I have is the pathetic words of being able to ask all of you to potentially unmute yourselves and then offer a round of applause for a wonderful talk and a great set of interactions.
Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for a great discussion and great questions.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you so much. Thank you, Charles and Leah.
Thanks to all of you. All right, and have a safe and healthy weekend.
Happy
Thank you.
Friday,
Thank you.
everybody.
You as well. Happy Friday.
Bye-bye.
You. Bye.